Now our next presenter, Dvir, he's an innovative and highly motivated technology leader with a proven track record and 10 years of experience in product, R&D, and management. And Dvir is going to take us home.
I didn't find the unmute button. Hi everyone. After all of these amazing talks about different types of attacks, let's talk a little bit about remediation and prioritization. But I will start with a short intro, if you don't mind. I'm Dvir, and I'm a Myrror Security VP of Product. I started my career as a developer, front-end, back-end, team lead, group lead, and then moved to product position. I was interested in understanding more of how the business work, and this is why I moved to kind of more product positions. It's my fifth startup from the ground up and fourth in cybersecurity. I was one of the first employees in Sentinel-1. One of the first employees in Cycognito, the first employee in Cyrus, and one of the first employees in Myrror Security as well. So nice to meet you guys. Next. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about vulnerabilities because we've covered that a lot. The formal definition of a vulnerability is written on the board. A vulnerability is a weakness in information system security procedures, internal controls, or implementation that could exploited or triggered by threat source. My less formal definition is also written on the board. Think of vulnerability as a hole in the wall of your house. Someone might go through it, okay? And now let's take a moment to explore when this is actually the truth. Let's take a moment to consider why we should care about assessing and prioritizing vulnerabilities to begin with. Nowadays, almost every software uses open source libraries, as all of the speakers before me said. And the reason is simple, speed. As the open source and security risk analysis OSRA report puts it, open source libraries are the foundation for literally every application in the industry. Or in every industry. Using open source libraries saves tons of time of coding and debugging. And by that, shorten the time to deliver the application. The problem is that studies shows us that the vast majority of open source libraries have or had, at least at some point, one vulnerability. Now, let's talk a little bit about the differences between direct and indirect dependencies. Keep in mind that open source projects are no different. They wish to deliver faster too, and therefore they also use their own share of open source libraries. That means that when a company adds an open source library, they are probably adding not just the library they intended to add, but adding more libraries as a result. The actual terms are direct dependency, which is a package you've added directly to your project, and transitive dependency, which is a package added implicitly by your dependencies. So if your application uses package A and package A uses package B, then your application indirectly depends on package B. And the biggest problem is that package B is vulnerable, and by that your project is also vulnerable. As said before, almost all the projects use open source libraries. Studies shows us that the vast majority of vulnerabilities can be traced back to a transitive dependency that created when a developer used an open source component. Since software composition analysis, SCA, platforms alert on every single possible vulnerability in your code base, this can quickly lead to an alert fatigue. An alert fatigue is, for example, when you're coming back from a vacation. Think of it if you ever went to a 2-week vacation or a week vacation and you come back and you have tons of emails. what is the first thing that you're doing? Closing the computer and go get coffee. Like, who can handle it? It's too much. And that's the same goes with vulnerabilities when you have tons of vulnerabilities. The immediate conclusion is we should just fix the transitive dependencies, right? How can it be? Well, how? In any large enough code base, there will simply be too many transitive vulnerabilities to fix. And fixing a transitive dependency vulnerability is done by upgrading its parent dependency. But how can we know if the newer parent version contains the fixed version of the dependency? That means that we need to prioritize them, or we will waste, again, tons of time. Going back to the hole in the wall example, in physical security, a defender might ask himself some questions regarding the hole in the wall example. Is the hole fixable? Is it possible to go through it? What can pass through the hole in the wall? And is it even possible to get to the hole in the wall? And more. Look, we can take other conditions like the location and other things, but for the sake of this discussion, we'll focus only on those 4 questions. In application security, we can roughly divide those questions into 4 categories. Fix available. Is it possible to fix the hole? Reachability. Can intruder reach the hole? Is there an actual method of exploit for the vulnerability, or does it require any special tools? Exploitability. And business impact, which is what can pass through the wall, and how can it affect the residents behind the wall? All of those questions and more should factor in when deciding on the actual priority of a vulnerability, and will help us prioritize vulnerabilities effectively. Now let's dive deep into every one of those questions. First and foremost, security strategy. As an important question is, where should we perform our prioritization? Statically or dynamically? There are many different approaches to prioritization, but the majority fall in 2 categories: static analysis and dynamic analysis. Static analysis basically means do it as left as possible on your code. Dynamic analysis means do it as right as possible on runtime when the machine is running and somebody might actually exploit something. There are pros and cons for each of those methods and approaches. But for the sake of this discussion, we will choose as left as possible to go with static, because we want to do it as early as possible in the SDLC, okay, before it hits production. Choosing the static approach is relatively low overhead approach of doing it because you don't need to install stuff, and this is what we'll focus on this talk. The first factor is pretty simple. Is a fix available? There is a major difference between direct dependencies and transitive dependencies. But let's talk first about direct dependencies. We can assume that the majority of vulnerabilities that exist in the wild, there is an update that can be applied that will fix the vulnerability. Why is that? Because it's custom that before publishing a vulnerability, you're updating the vendor and waiting for a fix. That's custom, and most of the time it actually happens. So the vendor will be able to release a new version with the fix for the vulnerability. If there isn't, it's also easy to know because you can easily go to the NIST site or OSV. There are tons of sites that will basically tell you which version fix a specific vulnerability. The problem begins with transitive vulnerabilities fixes, which is the majority of the vulnerabilities, as we said before. We can assume that there is a fix, but does the parent of the dependency that we've added contains that fix? If it's a second tier or third tier, it's also a problem. So basically, it means that we need to simulate it. We need to upgrade and see if it contains the correct version, or simply go into the code and actually start checking, which is kind of a problem. Again, the problem is transitive. Now let's talk a little bit about exploitability. The context in which a vulnerability exists is super relevant to its exploitation. It's not enough to simply know that we can have a critical vulnerability. We should also ask ourselves whether an attacker can actually take advantage of that vulnerability. There are several ways to determine if an attacker can exploit a vulnerability, and we'll talk a little bit about most of them. The first method that we'll explore is the CVSS score, the exploitability metrics in the CVSS score. Exploitability metrics relate specifically to the thing that is vulnerable. Vulnerability is not only for software. It can also be for machines, for bigger things like Windows or Linux or Cisco machines and stuff like that. With regard to any specific configuration or other compensated controls, exploitability metrics have 4 components. Attack vector, which is an indicator of the level of access required for an attacker to exploit a vulnerability. Okay, do I need a physical access? Do I need internet access? And more. Attack complexity, which indicates the conditions beyond the attacker's control that must exist in order to exploit the vulnerability, like specific configuration, for example. I need a specific port to be enabled, for example. Privilege required, which is describing the level of privileges or access an attacker must have before successful exploit. Do I need the root access or stuff like that? And user interaction that describe whether a user or other the attacker is required to do anything in particular in exploiting the vulnerability. The second thing that I want to explore is EPSS. EPSS on its own is a complete discussion, okay? But to put it in a simple word, it started a couple of years ago. EPSS, the EPSS system is basically a measure of the likelihood of a vulnerability to be exploited in the wild. And it's the percentile of that vulnerability compared to the rest of the vulnerabilities. Okay, basically 2 metrics. On top of that, there are a lot of tools nowadays that might simulate an exploitability, like Metasploit or Tenable. And there are also databases of script that might help you, like XploitDB, that knows how to simulate stuff. So combining all of them together will eventually yield a good result of exploitability. Business impact. The next factor is basically business impact, which will actually happen if the vulnerability, what will actually happen if the vulnerability gets caught? Can I have an effect on the machine? The CVSS and EPSS are not enough because they don't take the organization or the product context as a factor while scoring the vulnerability. Let's take 2 examples, Log4j and SnakeYam. Log4j is a very big known vulnerability. But in order for Log4j to actually happen, the machine needs to be exposed to the internet. There should be some interface between the user and Log4j in order for Log4j to actually run code to the machine. If the machine is completely behind the scene on a, I don't know, an EC2 or EKS machine or a Docker or something like that, nobody can access it. Nobody can exploit Log4j. Same goes to SnakeYam. A vulnerability happened a few, I think, 6 months ago, or maybe even more. SnakeYAML is a package that's responsible for encrypting and decrypting stuff, and a lot of people are using it to parse YAML files. As a result, the vulnerability means that if you parse a YAML file, it might lead to a remote code execution on the machine. But again, there needs to be a YAML file coming from a user. So if there won't be any input from the user, or if the input doesn't contain YAML file, or if the machine doesn't really connect to the internet, again, this exploitability, even if it exists, it doesn't apply to the company. Next, we have the reachability. In vulnerability analysis terminology, reachability is a property of a piece of code that indicates whether it will or will not be called under an application normal operation conditions. It basically means whether a specific function is being called or not. In Myrror, we'd like to take an example of a calculator. Think of your dependency as a calculator. The calculator has 4 functions. multiply, divide, plus, and minus. The vulnerable function is multiply, but you're not using the multiply. You're using only the plus and minus. Do you need to fix it? So we believe you don't. There is no reason, because if you are not using the multiply, why should you fix it? But the important thing to remember is that you might use the multiply because the developers doesn't know it's vulnerable. So what required is to continually check on every commit or every period of time that the vulnerable function is not reachable. And how can you do that? I'll go over with you a little bit about how to achieve reachability. So the way that we do it in Myrror, we are starting by building an IST, which is an abstract syntax tree from your source code. Basically, what it means that we're starting from like an init function and building a tree of all of the calls and all of the functions, all of the parameters that exist. And we enrich it with a call to an external calls, external dependencies on that specific graph. What it helps us is that now we have all of the external calls from our code to dependencies, whether direct or indirect, it doesn't really matter. But we have all of the calls to dependencies. And what do we do next is going with those calls, an entry point to a graph, and building a graph called CFG, which is a code flow graph from those entry points, from those external calls, from our code. And by doing that, we're extending our AST to a bigger graph that contains our dependencies, both direct and transitive dependencies. And what's left is knowing which function is vulnerable and going through the graph and basically seeing if there is one or more paths that leads to the vulnerable function. That's it. Let's move to a quick demonstration of our platform and how are we doing the reachability.
Okay, I'm going to give you controls so that you can share from your screen.
Can you see my screen? Great. This is our dashboard. Quick, nothing important at the moment. But if I'll go to our discovery page, those are all of the repositories that I have in my GitHub account. I'll go to a repository that I've scanned continuously called Nakos. It's a very known repository that I cloned. It has close to 15K forks. In this dependency, I have 1,742 dependencies, which is a lot. And I have around 122 different vulnerabilities. Within them, 23 are critical and 50 are high. And obviously, I don't want to fix 73 issues. It's too much. It's too many. It will take me too much time to do all of the cutting and all of the prioritization. So what can I do? Let's start cutting it down. So the first thing I will do, I will simply filter by high and critical. What it gives me 73, which is still a lot. Who wants to fix 73 issues? So let's do another thing. Let's filter by reachability. Only the reachable vulnerabilities I want to fix. Let's apply that filter, and immediately you'll see that I've cut 90% of the noise. From 122, I went down to 4 only vulnerabilities that I need to fix. I think that's enough for today. Any questions? I have one question.
Well, yeah, I have a couple interesting questions. And there's so much to unpack in what you just said, but after you prioritize, how do you reflect on the needed action for the engineers? Like, what are they supposed to do next? Where do they start?
Great question. What they should do next is basically check which versions it's fixing the vulnerability that was healed. In Myrror, we have a feature called remediation plan, which is basically grouping of all of the fixes to a specific dependency file and indicating in which line you need to change which version to which version and which vulnerabilities eventually they will fix. This ability gives you the ability to know in very short steps, in very short amount of time that you need to invest, what do you need to do in order to improve your security posture. So basically it means that you need to start going dependency file by dependency file and upgrade the dependencies to a version that doesn't contain any vulnerability or the least severe vulnerabilities that exist.
Wow, that's interesting. You know, one of the things that is incredibly important here in the United States and around the world for sure are SBOMs, you know, software bills of materials. And what about incorporating the reachability, you know, data there? Because that's something that the United States government is looking at right now in a very powerful way. And what are your thoughts about SBOMs?
Yeah, definitely interesting. SBOM is a very interesting piece of information because when you develop software and you distribute it, eventually your customer doesn't really know what he's installing, if it's a software that you need to install, or even accessing, because when I access a site on my browser, I also get packages, the JavaScript packages that you've added. So I really don't know what will I get. So SBOM purpose is to basically tell you that's what's in it. Don't be afraid, that's what we have inside. Now, the problem is what we have inside is that I don't really know what is being used and where and how, and does it have vulnerabilities on it? So there is an addition called VEX, basically all of the issues that exist on all of the dependencies, and it's an enrichment to all of the data that contains on the SBOM. Part of that VEX information is reachability, which is, again, whether a specific vulnerability or function is reachable or not.
Wow. And as we're wrapping up here, you know, how can someone be sure that the automated tool doesn't present them with, you know, false negatives?
False negatives are also always a problem. The problem with false negative is not the detectors or the scanners, is most of the time the ability to extract dependencies from your project. Eventually, it requires some testing. You need to test several tools, and you need to compare one to another and see which one's eventually giving you the most accurate list of dependencies. Here in Myrror, we invested tons of time on accurating all of those nitty-gritty things, because for us, being accurate is the most important thing.
Indeed. So for our audience, please make sure to include any final questions in the Q&A. As we're wrapping up here, make sure to visit LinkedIn Application Security Virtual Meetups, and the recordings and presentations will be uploaded to the LinkedIn page so that everybody can share this knowledge and socialize it with people who are unable to join us now, and stay tuned for more. And on a personal note, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Gary Berman. You'll see me in a superhero costume, so sort of hard to miss. But Lior, you know, on behalf of a grateful digital universe and to all of our great presenters, thank you so much for who you are and for what you do, and most importantly, why you do it. Stay tuned for more.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.